A massive drug tunnel has been discovered between the US and Mexico, and a $45 million cocaine haul has been seized. 4 people have been arrested and charged with trafficking that cocaine through this tunnel, which is pretty high tech, by the way. It's 2,000 feet long, going between Mexico and California, complete with electricity, ventilation, and a rail system with a hydraulic lift. That's according to federal officials. The tunnel was discovered as part of a months-long investigation into a warehouse for a supposed discount store, which was located near the Otay Mesa port of entry in San Diego, right across the border from Tijuana, Mexico, according to the U.S. Department of Justice. Authorities describe the discovery as a major blow to a powerful Mexican drug cartel.
Put directly, cocaine is now the lifeblood of the cartels. And what you see here today is a cardiac arrest for their system. For those defendants, they thought they saw a light at the end of the tunnel. In fact, what they saw were our lights and sirens. They will have their day in court, and we will have our justice.
Well, joining me now is someone who has spent years studying drug policy and who, by his own admission, loves talking about tunnels and the many ways that drugs make their way into the US. Sanho Tree, director of the Drug Policy Project at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for chatting with us here on DW. Let's just dive straight in. How big of a catch is this discovery?
I think these tunnels are very significant, but they're rarely talked about. So most of the time we hear about boat strikes. The Trump administration is blowing up these little boats in the Pacific and the Caribbean. But that's a tiny, tiny drop in the bucket when you consider how many tons are moved through these tunnels. But there have been about approximately more than 300 of these discovered since the 1990s. So they don't discover them often, and by the time they do discover them, we have no idea how many months or years they've been in operation. So to give you some perspective, in 2011, they found one of these major tunnels, again, in Tijuana, and it had a full electric rail system, cinder block walls. It was very elaborate. And they found 40 tons of cannabis on the Mexican side waiting to come to the United States. So once they build these tunnels, they can operate them 24/7 if they wanted to. And the only limitation is finding an excuse to move a vehicle out of your safe house on the U.S. side of the border. So very often they'll try to have an emergence point that's in a warehouse or someplace where there's a lot of vehicular traffic rather than a residential house. So that's your only limitation, is how discreetly can you move a truck or a van in and out of that safe house on the U.S. side. And once these tunnels are open, they can also repatriate cash going south. That's one of the things that's very difficult for drug cartels to do because the dogs sniff for cash. And they can also move ammunition and guns southbound to Mexico.
Wow, so definitely a lot of options there. $45 million worth of cocaine sounds like a lot, to me at least. I mean, is it in the grand scheme of things? Will this one seizure have an impact on the drug trade between Tijuana and California?
Very, very, very little. This is a drop in the bucket. This is, when you think about those 41 tons of cannabis in that one tunnel I mentioned, those are the kinds of numbers we're talking about. And so this is about a 1-ton seizure. So most of it has already probably gotten through to the U.S. And so this is only what they were able to find on hand.
So I might already know the answer to this, but how quickly can organizations or cartels recover from something like this? Is it fairly straightforward?
It's a loss to any cartel that loses a tunnel because it takes a lot of time and investment to dig these things. But nonetheless, they have no shortage of engineers and people willing to dig those tunnels. And so these are very valuable targets. Most of the time we hear about ports of entry and seizures of drugs at legal ports of entries, where they have to inspect all the vehicles and people coming across the border. And that gets most of the attention in terms of seizures. Now, we only seize anywhere from 3 to 10% of the drugs coming into the United States. Very, very little. We don't know how much else is out there. So I compare it to the way physicists, astrophysicists talk about dark matter in the universe. We know it's there. We can't see it. It's a known unknown, right? And this is what we're dealing with in terms of the actual drug supply. We have no idea where those other types of drugs are coming through. They're not coming through at ports of entry. Probably a lot of it is moving through tunnels, but there are many, many other modalities of smuggling drugs across that border. And so, for instance, one of the earlier adaptations was the cartels were using catapults, Roman era technology, to literally fling big bales of drugs over the wall to their accomplices on the other side. They even were so bold as to bolt an actual catapult onto the wall itself and had a rope you could pull down to move the arm down and put your drugs on, and it flings it right over the wall. They also use things like air cannon. So if you've ever been to a large sporting event at a big stadium in the US, they have T-shirt cannons. They shoot T-shirts into the audience. Cartels have something similar, but it's much, much larger, big diameter cannon powered by compressed air. And they mount these things in the back of vans or pickup trucks, and they literally shoot bales over the wall to their accomplices on the other side. There are there are drones. In recent years, they've used smaller drones, small delivery drones. But now we're in an era of industrial drones, agricultural drones that can lift half a ton to a ton very easily. And that's, I think, something to really keep an eye out for. Because there's no accomplice, there's no one to capture and interrogate. And so it's relatively low risk for cartels. There are ultralight aircraft they use that go over the wall but under the radar, and they have a drop cage underneath, so the pilot pulls the lever and hundreds of pounds of drugs can drop. There are the maritime routes, not just small boats, but they use semi-submersibles, which are inaccurately called submarines. It's 90% underwater, and they have the conning tower, which is above water. But those can carry 6 to 12 tons of drugs per shipment. And we got better at detecting those small conning towers. So now the cartels are actually building proper submarines that can dive up to 50 feet below water. Yeah, actual submarines, real submarines. They can also use things like narco torpedoes, which are basically, it looks like a giant oversized torpedo. They bolt them underneath freighters and cargo vessels, or they can tow them with a long cable behind pleasure yachts, fishing boats, other kinds of vessels, so that they're invisible. And if they're stopped by Coast Guard, they release the lever, and it releases the torpedo, which then it's programmed to rise to the surface every few hours and emit a coded signal to tell the follow-on vessel where to pick up the drugs. There's lots of ways to move drugs across the border: air, sea, and land, and underground.
Yeah, clearly. I mean, you said we have no idea how these drugs are getting smuggled, but it sounds like you've quite a good idea of how these drugs are getting smuggled. And I suppose we'll see even most likely more of those very creative ways of smuggling drugs if these tunnels keep being discovered, right?
Yes, though I think the tunnels are one of their better investments, because once they're open, if you can operate it for a year, you're talking about just unbelievable amounts of tonnage you could move through those tunnels. So we don't know how long those tunnels are in operation before they're detected.
And I was wondering as well, how is it even possible to build these tunnels without that whole project being detected?
There are lots of engineers willing to take on those jobs. That's how they broke El Chapo out of prison the first time, right? They dug a tunnel, a kilometer-long tunnel, just for him to use with an electric rail car and everything. So if they can do that into a prison, you can imagine they can do this in many different ways. There are listening devices and technologies. They try to detect these tunnels, but they can go very deep. So I've seen one tunnel that went 100 feet below ground. It went so deep that it actually went below the water table. So these engineers had to design cisterns and drainage systems to deal with all the groundwater they were running into. But even with all that investment, it was still worth it to them, because once it's open, the profits are limitless. People may be familiar with the term X Prize, where a government or a foundation or a billionaire will put up a prize money, saying the first person who can invent something or other, the first a solar-powered plane that can cross an ocean will get, $100 million or 500 million or whatever. What the US government has done is that we have set up an X Prize for drug traffickers. If you can find ways to penetrate our borders, you stand to make billions of dollars in theory, right? Until you're discovered. And so that is an incredible incentive to cause this economy to evolve at a lightning pace. Conversely, we also try to throw more law enforcement at this problem at the same time. And decade after decade, what we run into over the long run is this Darwinian filtering effect, so that we are basically thinning out the herd and leaving only the most efficient operations behind. So that the type of people, when we escalate law enforcement year after year in this blanket kind of way, trying to just get as many numbers up as we can, the people we typically capture are the people who are either dumb enough, clumsy enough, or poor and vulnerable enough to get caught. Conversely, the people we tend to miss year after year, decade after decade, are the people who are the most adaptable, the most innovative, the most cunning, not necessarily the most violent, because violence is not a good recipe for longevity in this field, but the ones who are the most adaptable, right? And so we've been forcing this economy to evolve at a super Darwinian rate for many decades now. And that is a serious problem.
And you've really advocated for a different approach to tackling drugs in your research. What do you think about the current strategies that are applied by both Mexico and the US when it comes to the war on drugs?
It's mostly a US-driven strategy by the Trump administration, and they want more kinetic, more militarized drug enforcement. It's nothing we haven't been doing for many decades, but they want to do it with even more firepower, which will not produce a different result. You cannot use a military solution to solve what is fundamentally an economic problem that has social and political and economic consequences downstream. That's not to say it's not a serious issue, an important issue to take very seriously, but there is no militarized solution to this problem. More importantly, there is no international high command of the drug economy that sits in the middle of a spiderweb conspiracy that finally says, okay, we've had enough. The Trump administration is too tough. Everyone surrender now. You growers stop growing. You smugglers stop smuggling. The money launderers stop what you're doing. Users give it up. Everyone just surrender now. That will never happen. So for generations now, we have been declaring and waging a war against an enemy who was quite literally incapable of an organized surrender. We have been fighting a forever war, and one that enriches the very people we're trying to punish. It's important to remember that when we talk about drugs like cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, fentanyl, these are minimally processed agricultural and chemical commodities that cost pennies per dose to manufacture. There is nothing exotic or difficult to make about these drugs, right? These are very simple commodities. And yet we have this, we've discovered this new alchemy that the alchemists in the Middle Ages, they looked for centuries to find a formula to turn lead into gold. We have a formula that turns basically plants and basic chemicals into the equivalent of gold. And we wonder why we can't stop it. Because the drug war is essentially producing a price support, all right, for drug traffickers. Think of it that way. It's a crop subsidy, it's a price support. These things should not be worth much money at all. And yet, the more risk we build into the system, the higher the risk premium each smuggler can charge the next person in the smuggling chain.
And what do you think an alternative approach could be?
So we need to talk about regulation, and it's easy for me as an outsider to say that. But let's take the example of President Calderon, who was elected in 2005 in Mexico, comes into power 2006. He was kind of Trumpian in the sense that he thought, I could be really tough. I will throw 50,000 federal forces at this problem. And what he did was he took an incipient turf war between cartels and made it into a national conflagration. so that as soon as you weaken one cartel, the others would fight to take over their turf and their trafficking routes. They thought that, their enemies were weakened now. It was their turn. So it turned into a national bloodbath that they still haven't recovered from. And by the end of his presidential term in 2012, he was at the United Nations General Assembly. And that is a remarkable speech he gave. This is the man who thought he could be tougher than anyone else on drugs. And by the end of his term, he was saying, we need to talk about market-based solutions, which is diplomatic code for legalization and regulation of drugs. Many people have said this. Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, George Shultz, the former Secretary of State of the United States, many high-ranking officials, once they're out of office, will say very bluntly that we need to look at other possibilities here, including regulation and taxation. Because you can't control a substance you deliberately drive underground. The people who control that economy are criminals, and by definition, very often they're organized crime. And so if you can bring those things out of the shadows, and you can actually regulate some of these substances, we could have very different results. So in Switzerland, for instance, they've had a prescription heroin for people who are seriously dependent. They've had that for decades now. It works very well. They do a much smaller level. They do that in Canada. And so if you can take away the impurities of the drugs and make sure people understand correct dosage, you get much better outcomes. You certainly don't see the overdose rates you see right now in the illicit market, where people are playing fentanyl roulette. They don't know what they're getting in these drugs anymore.
And I mean, how much of this ultimately comes down to demand in the US rather than supply? Can you really fight this issue without addressing the consumption in the US primarily?
Absolutely not. And so, yes, this is a primarily demand-driven issue. It's the dollars in the U.S. As long as people are willing to pay that ultimate street price, this entire economy hums along very nicely, and everyone gets rich or most people get rich in the process. The farmers themselves are, the peasant farmers. They don't make much money, but the traffickers. That's where the money is. And the higher the risk we build into the system, the higher the risk premium they can charge. So I like to say that there are two groups that never want the drug war to end. The first are drug traffickers, and the other are drug warriors, because neither one can make a reasonable living without the other, right? You need that price support in order to make this economy work. And so much like alcohol prohibition in the century ago in the United States, produced very similar dynamics. And ultimately, we decided we had to regulate alcohol, not blow them up. We didn't call them alco-terrorists, the way Donald Trump calls these drug traffickers narco-terrorists, because it doesn't help us understand the phenomenon of drug use and addiction, and it doesn't tell us anything about regulation. It's just a recipe for more war.
Thank you so much for that. Sanho Tree, Director of the Drug Policy Project at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. A fascinating story. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, we want your take as well. What do you think? Is the war on drugs working? What do you think about alternative approaches? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. I'm Hannah Hummel. Thank you so much for joining us.